Good afternoon. Thank you all for attending today's presentation, a Trademark Specimens Overview for Experienced Filers. A link to today's slides was included in the email you received with the link to join this presentation. As a reminder, we are recording today's presentation, and within 2 to 3 weeks, the recording will be made available for viewing on both the USPTO website and our YouTube channel. We will send an email to everyone that registered for the program to let you know when the recording is. The email with the recording will also contain information on CLE credits for attending today's presentation. If you have questions during the presentation today, please email them to tm_webinar@uspto.gov. There will be time for answers from the presenters at the end of the session. If you are watching a recording of this presentation, please email your questions to tmpolicy@uspto.gov. Our presenters for today's webinar are Mark Rademacher, a legal policy staff attorney, and Renee Cervantes, a managing attorney. And now I'll turn it over to Renee.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our discussion on specimens. We're very glad to have you today. Throughout this presentation, you're going to have an opportunity to interact with us through a few polls where you're going to step into the role as the examining attorney. So to get us ready, we're going to open up a little icebreaker poll for you. You need to look to the right side of your screen. Look for a set of blue bar graphs with an asterisk next to them. Click on that, and that should open up a poll for you that asks you some questions about the pandemic and how you are faring with those. So we're going to give you about 30 seconds to respond to that poll so we can make sure everybody knows how to do that. Okay, this is your 10-second warning before we close the poll. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close that poll now. Now, as I said, we're going to have you all interacting some with us today, so we hope that you will find it helpful and instructive. I am a managing attorney, and I have been with the office for almost 15 years, and I'm one of those folks who supervises the examining attorneys that you work with. I'm going to also introduce my partner today, Mark Rademacher. Mark?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending. I'm glad you're all here. Can we go to the next slide, please? So why are specimens so important? It's because the USPTO needs to evaluate these specimens to make sure that whatever mark registers reflects how a mark is used in the marketplace. Next slide. I'm not going to talk about use in commerce in depth. Instead, I'm going to, next slide, just take a time out to talk about the fact that use in commerce is something that you need to show during the lifetime of a registration, even after it registers. In order to maintain your registration, you're going to need to show use in commerce at various points during its lifetime. And you'll need to provide specimens. Now, there's a limited exception for excusable non-use during the maintenance filing periods, and that's for non-use due to special circumstances that are beyond the owner's control or forced by outside causes. COVID-19, the pandemic, may be a special circumstance excusing non-use. The key is that, like any other special circumstance, there needs to be an explanation of how that special circumstance actually forced non-use of the mark for the goods and services. It's not probably enough to just say COVID-19 forced us to stop using the mark with the goods and services. You have to connect the dots between how COVID-19 forced non-use of the mark. In addition to that explanation of the special circumstances, you're going to need to provide us the date non-use began or use stopped and the date when use will resume, as well as an explanation of any steps being taken to resume use. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into detail about use in commerce because I think you're all familiar with that at this point. Next slide. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Renee instead to talk about acceptable specimens for goods. Renee.
Okay, so when you submit a specimen for goods, you basically have two options. Most specimens will actually show the mark on the goods. Next slide. Next slide. So if you look at this false graph mark on the bottom of this cup, this is the type of specimen that will always show specific and appropriate use for goods. Now, you can also give us a tag or a label for the goods. Next slide, please. Oh, before I say that, though, let me talk about when you give us specimens. If you look carefully at this particular specimen, this is for bottles of ink. It would be acceptable, but it's only acceptable because the label is completely visible in the middle. If you look at the two bottles on the outside, if those were the specimens, we would not be able to take that because the entire mark needs to be visible on the specimen. Next slide, please. Now, so I got a little ahead of myself. Unattached labels and tags are also acceptable. However, they need to have sufficient product information so that we can see that there is a, first of all, that we can tell that it is in commerce, but also so that we can see that nexus between the goods that they are purporting to show use for. Next slide, please. So this is an example of an acceptable label. You'll notice that the mark is moon tying tea over on the left. You'll see that throughout this particular specimen, there are various different types of information that would typically be included on an actual label. For example, there's the pricing barcode information, there's the nutritional information, there's also an indication that the goods are organic. We look for these types of information and criteria when we have unattached labels. Next slide, please. This is an example of an unacceptable tag. This lacks all of that information and essentially is no different than either a printer's proof or a rendering of the mark. Next slide, please. Now, the other option you have for a specimen for goods is you can have a display. They come in two types, physical displays and electronic displays. So as to the physical display, we're literally talking about you taking a picture of the goods for sale when they're set up in either a window shop or in some other manner. There are other types of displays that are described in more detail in the TMEP, but the main thing is that it needs to show use of the goods at the point of sale. Next slide, please. Electronic displays are very similar, and so are our catalogs. However, we look for the three things you see on the slide. And if any of them are missing, we will usually have to issue a refusal and a requirement for a substitute specimen. Next slide. So if you look at this particular example, first click please, you will see that we have a picture or description of the goods. There's the eyeglasses and there's a description of the eyeglasses. Either works. Next click. You will see the mark clearly associated with the goods. Next click please. And you will see up at the upper right-hand corner the shopping bag, which is indicating that the goods are for sale on that particular website. That's really key. Next slide. Because that particular factor, I would say, is a very common reason why we cannot take website evidence for goods. Because as you all know, we cannot take advertising for goods. And if you don't have something like one of these types of indications on your website specimen, the specimen most of the time will fail as advertising for goods. Next slide, please. Now, specimens for components or ingredients are a special type of specimen. There is a distinction between a component and a finished product. So let me give you an example. If you think of a computer chip that is only sold inside of computer hardware, such as the Intel chip, that's an example of a component type of good where you would have to show use on that component. If you give us a specimen just showing the mark associated with the hardware, it fails to show proper use in commerce. It has to show the component part being the goods rather than the finished product. Another example would be clothing. If your client, for example, produces particular fibers or particular fabrics that she used to make the clothing and markets it under a specific trademark, that specimen absolutely must show not the finished clothing associated with the mark, but the fiber inside the clothing associated with the mark. Next slide, please. Just a reminder, advertisements for goods almost always is going to be refused. There are some exceptions. For example, there are some specialized goods where specimens like brochures are used at the point of sale to associate the product. If you're going to give us something like that, you need to provide some kind of an explanation as to how that brochure is being used at the point of sale. Don't assume just because we will theoretically take a brochure as a specimen for goods that all brochures for specimens are acceptable. Next slide, please. Now we're going to open up a poll here. As we're opening up the poll, and remember the way that you will access the polls is you will look at the right hand of your screen for the bar graph and click on it once you see that little asterisk show up. I want you to look at this particular specimen, and if you were an examining attorney, I want you to indicate in the poll whether or not you would refuse this specimen. Now, similar to the one we saw, but look at it very carefully. And remember those three factors that are required for an online specimen for goods. We're going to give you about 20 seconds. Okay, we're going to give you a 10-second warning at this point. Okay, we're going to close the poll at this point, and you'll get a chance to see the results. Now, hopefully, next click, you said no. The reason is if you look very carefully, there is no means for ordering the goods here. You do see the other two factors. You see the mark and you see a textual description of the goods. But if you look carefully at this particular example, you are not going to find that there's a way to purchase the goods. So this would be refused as advertising for goods. It looks like most of us caught that, so excellent job on your first day as an examining attorney. Next slide, please. All right, so at this point, I'm going to turn you over to my partner in crime, Mark.
Thanks, Renee. So what about services? So specimens for services are a little less rigid than specimens for goods. There are basically two flavors here. There's the most common type of specimen for services, which is advertising, which Renee just talked about not being acceptable for goods, generally speaking. Advertising is a perfectly good specimen for services. Another type or another flavor of specimen for services is a rendering type specimen, or a specimen that shows the mark in the context of the service activity actually being performed. Next slide, please. So in either case, there has to be this direct association between the mark and the services in the application or the registration in consumers' minds. Next slide, please. For advertising, generally that means there's going to have to be some sort of reference to the services in the advertising. And then the mark has to be used to identify the services listed in the ID of the application. Next slide, please. For rendering, we might not necessarily see an explicit reference to the services. Instead, we can infer from the context or environment that the services are being performed and the mark is appearing in that context. Now, one caveat with this is that if you do submit a specimen that doesn't have reference to the services and you're thinking, oh, this is a rendering type specimen, if it's not clear to the examining attorney, you're probably going to get a refusal. So this is an opportunity for you to, in the maybe specimen description, to give as much context to the specimen as possible to enable the examining attorney to confidently make a decision as to whether it's an acceptable rendering specimen. Next slide, please. So here's down pat, a perfect example of an advertising specimen for services. You'll see this is a web page. The mark is Urban Loft Furnishings. The services are online retail store services featuring furniture. And you'll see that there's the mark on the top of the page. And then in the Who We Are section, there's a description of the services as being a trend-setting online furniture store. So there's a reference to the service, there's the mark appearing there, and there's a direct association between the two. Next slide, please. Now here's an unacceptable specimen because we don't have enough of a description of the services in the specimen itself to give us enough idea of what services are being performed under the mark. Although you don't necessarily have to spell out what the services are word for word in the specimen, there has to be enough there that it's not left completely to the imagination as to what the services are being provided are. Here the mark is IOBIT, and then we'll reproduce the description in the purple box in the next slide. Next slide. And this is for computer programming services, maintenance of computer software, research and development in in the field of computer software, and a host of other software-related services. That box that we just saw doesn't have enough of a reference to the type of service to make it acceptable for the service mark. They say, we also promise that we'll keep providing first-class free software and online service for personal or commercial use or non-commercial use. There's a reference to software there. They're providing software somehow, but the online service, we're completely in the dark as to what that might be. Similarly, in the second paragraph, they talk about being a Windows system service provider. Again, we don't know what type of service provider they are here. So this was found to be an unacceptable specimen for these services. Next slide, please. So what about signage? Signage can be a great specimen for services. Just be careful that there be enough there to reference the service in addition to the mark. The case I'm referring to here is In Re Republic National LLC, where the service provider provided a specimen that just simply reproduced the mark on the door to the offices of the applicant. There was no reference to the service, and as a result, the board found that the specimen was unacceptable. Next slide, please. So what about software specimens? The USPTO makes this distinction between software as a service and software as a good. And you're going to have to identify your software in one of the two ways, effective January 2019. Even though the consumer may not care whether they're being provided the software as a service or software as a good, the PTO makes that distinction between the good and service, and the types of specimens which are acceptable for a good may not be acceptable for services, and vice versa. So for goods, you can software as goods. Specimens can be any of the traditional types of good specimens, packaging, the mark on the recording itself. These are less common these days. So you might want to show the mark on the display screen for the software, or a screenshot of the software running. If it's downloadable software, again, you'll have to show that there's an association between the mark and the software, and that there's a means to purchase or download the software. Next slide. So a means to purchase or download means just that. It can't be something that leads to a purchase. It has to be a means to actually purchase or download. For example, in In-Rate Pure Storage Inc., a request to demo button was found insufficient to be an acceptable specimen for software, downloadable software, because requested demo generally indicates that the owner or the consumer is going to experience the software but not necessarily purchase it. The purchase will happen somewhere downstream of the demo. So this was an unacceptable specimen for downloadable software. Next slide, please. Here's an acceptable specimen for downloadable software. Click, you can see the mark, portal. Next slide, please. You can see the mark, portal, click at the top of the specimen, and you can also see the means to download, the little cloud icon, click there on the screenshot from the phone. This is a perfectly acceptable specimen for downloadable software. Next slide, please. Now we're going to take a time out and put you in the shoes of the examining attorney again and open a poll to see why you would refuse this specimen. Let me know why you would refuse it, or if you would refuse it at all. The mark is botnet. It's for downloadable computer game software. And the specimen is described as a website used in commerce. I'll give you a few seconds to complete the poll. Okay, I'll give you a 10-second warning. And we'll close the poll. And we'll see what the results were. If you look at the specimen closely, you'll see the mark. You'll see a description of the software. You'll see even screenshots of the software. So the mark is there. There's an association between the goods, the downloadable game software, and the mark. However, in this case, there's no means to download. So if you answered no means to download or purchase, we agree with you. Next slide, please. So what about user manuals for software? User manuals under the Ultraflight case can be acceptable for software. The only thing to be careful is that it's actually a user manual for software and not another type of manual that has another purpose other than to show how to use the software. The case on this is in-ray user first. Next slide, please. Here, the applicant submitted a PDF instruction manual with the mark user first placed on the cover. And the board found that this was not an acceptable specimen for software because this specimen referred to certification training lab, which kind of raised a question as to whether this was an actual user manual for software. Next slide, please. So what about online non-downloadable software specimens? Just like any other service specimen, you have to show a direct association between the mark and the services in consumers' minds. So it's just like any other type of service mark specimen. Next slide, please. However, you might want to keep in mind that because we know that a login screen is a way that online software is accessed, we'll accept a login screen without necessarily a complete textual description of what the software is. It's helpful, but it's unnecessary. So online non-downloadable software specimen could be acceptable as just a login screen. The next slide, please. Here's an example of that. You can see the mark in the upper left-hand corner. Click, please. And you can see the fields for logging in to the online non-downloadable software in the center right of the screen. Click, please. This is perfectly acceptable for online non-downloadable software, even though there isn't necessarily a textual description of what the software is doing, because this is a generally recognized way to access online non-downloadable software. Next slide. So what about services that are being provided through software versus just providing the software itself? It's hard to make that distinction sometimes, and the way we think about it is if the applicant or owner is performing the service activity through the software is performing that activity for the consumer, then likely the specimen will be acceptable for services. But if the user or consumer is performing that activity themselves, then it's likely going to be a specimen that's acceptable for software. Let's look at an example of that. Next slide. First click. The mark here is Curb Karma, and it's an app, but the services you can see here are actually a service, not the app, and it's for online parking spot matching. And here, the screenshots for the app, which are shown in the bottom right corner, click, show that the app itself is making the matches, is showing the consumer where the parking spots are. So here, the software is performing that service activity matching and not the consumer. So this is an acceptable specimen for the services of online matching of parking space with consumers. Next slide, please. So what about social media specimens? Social media specimens are just like any other specimen. So you have to make sure they meet the requirements for goods specimens if the specimen is for goods, or service specimens if the specimen is for services. The one thing to kind of tread lightly around or be careful of is that to be careful of whether or not you're actually providing the social networking service. In many cases, the applicant or owner is probably not providing the social networking service. They're probably providing some other service that's being advertised through the social networking service. And the case on point here is In-Ray Florist Transworld Delivery. There, FTD had a mark Say It Your Way for creating an online community of registered users to engage in social networking. And they provided as their specimen printouts from their Twitter web pages, Twitter pages. And it showed FTD interacting with its consumers on Twitter, but this was not enough to show that FTD was actually providing the social networking service itself. The board found that although they were taking advantage of the forum to social network, FTD wasn't providing the forum or the means to social network in the specimens. It was Twitter that was providing the forum, not FTD. Next slide, please. So here's a good example of a social media type specimen. Notice it's not for social media. It's for fast food restaurant services. Click, and the mark is Sam Burgers. You can see that in the left side of the Facebook page. And it's for restaurants, and you can see a reference to the restaurants on the bottom of the page. Click. And so you have the mark, a reference to the services, an association between the mark and the services, and this is a perfectly acceptable specimen for restaurants. Next slide, please. Now that isn't to say that social media specimens would never be good for goods. There are cases where you can actually purchase things within a social media post. For example, Twitter has a buy button on some of its tweets that allow purchases to be made within the tweet. Again, this has to meet the requirements for any kind of electronic display for goods. It has to contain a picture or textual description of the goods. It has to show the mark in association with the goods, and there has to be that means for ordering or purchasing the goods, which is usually where people get tripped up. Now I'm going to switch gears and turn it over to Renee, who's going to talk about specimens that are not in use in commerce.
Okay, so next slide, please. There are basically three categories of specimens that we see that are not in use in commerce. They are either digitally created drawings of the goods rather than images of the actual goods themselves, or they are digitally altered where an existing image has been altered using some type of editing software to append a different trademark onto an existing product, generally an existing third-party product. And then there are mock-ups. Mock-ups are generally non-digital, but it's generally a situation where someone creates either stickers or labels that are used to simply submit with the application. In all cases, though, if these goods are actually not in use, goods or services are actually not in use in commerce, they're going to draw a refusal. Next slide, please. So, fake specimens are a problem because they affect the integrity of our registry, and they also can reach over to constituting fraud on the office. So you're going to want to pay close attention to the specimens that your clients give to you and make sure that you don't allow them to file anything that falls into any of these categories. Now don't worry, we're going to give you plenty of examples, and you're going to have a chance to interact with some polls to practice being able to spot these. Next slide, please. All right, now, if an examining attorney sees any instances or red flags of a specimen that's not in use in commerce, they're going to refuse it, and they're also going to issue a request for information. The purpose is to understand more about how these products, it's usually products, but can also be services, how these goods or services are sold in commerce, if that's true, and to also allow for correction of the faulty specimen. Next slide, please. If you get an RFI, you need to do your best to answer it as completely and make sure it's accurate as you can. If you can't answer certain things, you need to indicate that in your response. Next slide, please. Now, of course, you can always respond by amending your filing basis to a non-use-based filing basis, or you can, of course, give us a second substitute specimen. Next slide, please. Now, some of the things the examining attorney is going to look for. It's a long list. So the next two slides are going to show you some of the things that we look for to give us a tip-off that we may be dealing with a specimen that's not in use in commerce. Overall, I'm going to summarize these rather than read them all to you. Overall, we look for anomalies on that specimen. We look to see, are there particular areas of the specimen where the coloring is inconsistent, where the stylistic criteria of the lettering is different. We look for areas that are blurred or unusually sharp. Next slide, please. We look for areas that have different textures on the image. And we also typically do reverse image searching online so that we can find if a mark has been simply attached to an existing third-party product. In any of those cases, it's likely that the examining attorney is going to refuse that as a digitally created or mock-up specimen. Next slide, please. All right, so I promised you some examples. You're going to get plenty of practice with that. We're going to open up a new poll. And next slide. Now, don't respond to the poll until I tell you to. I'm going to go over an example first. Now, if you look at this particular set of specimens, you see an example of an unacceptable specimen and an acceptable specimen. On the left-hand side, it's unacceptable because it is clearly not product packaging. This is a two-dimensional drawing of the mark. It is not acceptable as a label because it lacks any of those other criteria or information about the product that would be expected on a label. So the specimen to your left would be refused. However, if you look on your right, we see the actual box that the wine glasses are packed inside. So we have an example of actual packaging. And we can tell it's a three-dimensional box from the image. We can see additional information that will be typical on packaging. So we would accept the specimen on the right. We would not accept the specimen on the left, which amounts to little more than a drawing or a rendering of the mark. Next slide, please. This is an example of two specimens, neither of which are acceptable because these are specimens that were created digitally on a computer. These are not actual shirts. And so when we see something like that, we are not able to accept this because this is clearly not the product itself, and it is not the way that that product would be encountered in commerce by actual consumers. So be very careful. Some of these drawings can be quite realistic. And in no case is a drawing of the product with the mark on the product an acceptable specimen. Next slide, please. This one should be obvious. This is an example of a digitally altered specimen. If you look at the actual product on your right-hand side, you will see the actual correct trademark, but you look to your left and you can see a specimen where the applicant has simply edited the image file of the third-party product and added their mark to a third-party product. This is the type of evidence that we typically will uncover when we do our reverse image searching. This would not be an acceptable specimen. Next slide, please. These are examples of the mock-ups that I talked about. Mock-ups, think of a mock-up as a bunch of made-up specimens that you just create so you can submit your application. The giveaways on these is that they would typically just be plain labels that are taped to products They would typically we will oftentimes see in co-pens different marks with the same types of labels on all of the different products. This is a type of situation where you, if it turned out that your client, in the unlikely event, actually does market it this way, you would need to explain that very carefully in your request to your RFI. However, in most cases, we would not accept specimens that look like this. Next slide, please. Now it's time for you to be an examining attorney. Would like for you to examine this specimen very carefully and think about the tip-offs that I talked about. So look and see if you see any of those anomalies in this specimen. And we're going to open up our poll, and if you see anything that you think indicates that this is either digitally created or digitally altered or mock-up, you should select no. But if you don't see any of that evidence, you should select yes. So we're going to give you about 20 seconds. Ten-second warning. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close this poll. And hopefully, if you're the examining attorney, you would take this specimen. Now, the things that the examining attorney would be noticing, it looks like a lot of you would not take this specimen. All right, well, that's actually very good. That opens up the discussion. Now, I'm going to tell you why you would take this specimen. If you look very, very carefully at the label, look at the stylization of the letters, you'll see that it's consistent. They're not a whole bunch of different fonts. You don't see odd colors sticking out. You also see the marks in the places on the product that you would expect a mark to show up, because that's another tip-off. When we see marks that are displayed in non-traditional fashions, that's usually a dead giveaway that a specimen has been digitally altered or digitally created. If you also look at the relative sizes of the different marks on here, you can certainly see marks and submarks, and the heel different mark is down at the bottom where you would typically find a tagline or a secondary trademark. So this would actually be an acceptable specimen. Okay, next slide. Now we're going to open up another poll for you. We want you to look at this particular specimen for golf shoes. The mark is Stealth. Keeping in mind the factors and tip-offs that I've discussed with you today, would you refuse or would you allow? I'm going to give you about 15 seconds. All right, 5-second warning. Okay, we're going to close this poll at this point. And hopefully, if you're all good examining attorneys, you would never accept this specimen. The reason is that there are a number of anomalies on this specimen that would lead you to believe that this is a specimen that's not in use in commerce. The most obvious is the way that the mark is placed on the shoe. It's in a very unusual manner. Shoe marks typically do not have the mark on the side of the shoe. They certainly are not crooked. And if you look very closely at the lettering of the word stealth, you're going to see quite a lot of blurriness or pixelation of the lettering there. That pixelation is a dead giveaway that there's probably two files superimposed on each other, and that there's noise around where the wording has been added to an existing image. So this is an example of a specimen that we would not accept. Next slide. Now we're going to open another poll and give you a chance to look at yet another specimen. I'm going to give you just about 15 seconds on this one as well. Five-second warning. Okay, so we're going to close this poll out, and can't wait to see the results of this one. Hopefully, no one would take this specimen as well, but this one is not as clear cut as it looks at first. So some of those of you who would not refuse, I can kind of understand why you might not refuse it. However, the two arrows show where the mark is. The placement on the specimen is unusual. You typically will never see a mark on the actual end of the flatware. You will usually see it, if anywhere, somewhere on the stem or on the handle. But now, even though the mark appears on the handle here, if you look at it carefully, it's actually upside down. And that's unusual. And that is consistent with applying a file on top of an existing picture of a fork. So at a minimum, the examining attorney would refuse this with a request for information. Most likely, the best course of action here would be to give a new specimen. Next slide, please. All right, one more poll for you. So we're going to open that up. And what I'm going to ask you to do is look at this. It should be familiar to you. And the mark is heel different again for supplements. And think about why you would explain to the applicant if you would refuse. And think about why you would allow this specimen if you would not refuse. We're going to give you 15 seconds on this one. Five-second warning. Okay, we're going to close this poll so you can see the results. Now, I want you to think about anomalies and how this particular specimen is very different from the one you saw on the previous slide. The heel different, contrary to the first time you saw this little bottle, heel different here is in a completely different style. The wording is also extremely sharp, very much sharper than the rest of the image, which is quite blurry. We don't like blurry specimens, by the way. You definitely want to give us good, high-quality image files. Now, if we saw this and we saw the differences in the sharpness and also the differences in the color, that very stark black, that would prompt a refusal for sure. And we also would note that the wording heel different here seems to float above that blurrier image. That's because of the unusual sharpness of the wording. And so this is a situation where you would definitely, if this is what your client gave you, you would probably want to see if they have something better to submit. Okay, last poll. Next slide. Now, look at this one very carefully too. This is our old friend Moontime Tea again. You're going to get it. I want you to look at this very carefully because this looks pretty good to me. Tell me, would you approve this specimen or would you reject this specimen? So would you refuse registration based on this specimen? Yes or no? Second warning. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close this poll. Now, I am curious to see how many people would accept this specimen because it is not acceptable. It's not acceptable because this is a printer's proof, or at the very least, it is a digitally created specimen. How do we know? Because of the machine language that's down in the bottom part in that little yellow section where you see all of that sort of Latinate language. That's placeholder language. That's usually a space that's held in a printer's proof that where the client hasn't quite decided what's going to go in that space, and so they put lettering or this kind of wording in there. When we see that kind of placeholder language, that is a dead giveaway that the specimen is not in use in commerce. So it looks like most of us got that, but around 500 of us might have missed that issue. Those are the types of things you're going to want to really look for before you submit your specimens from your clients. Okay, next slide, and I'm going to turn you now back over to my partner, Mark.
Thanks, Renee. Let's talk about web page URL and access date for a second. Beginning last year, February of last year, every web page specimen must include its URL and access date to be acceptable. There's an exception which we'll talk about in a second, but generally speaking, for web pages, you have to provide the URL and access date. You can provide it any way you want. There's no specific way to provide it. You can provide it directly on the specimen itself. You can provide it within the form. You can provide it in a later filed response as long as that statement is verified. Next slide, please. So you'll see in a minute the forms, and there are special fields for providing the URL and access date. But if you can't have trouble finding them or using them, you can put them other places in the form. You can put it in the specimen description, in the miscellaneous statement, or in the arguments, for example. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the easiest way to get us that information. This is just simply taking a screenshot of your computer screen with the web page of interest open. The mark here is the Farnham. It's for hotels. You can see that that captures the URL at the top of the page, and it captures the time and date you accessed this page at the bottom of the page because you've taken a screenshot of the computer screen. Next slide, please. Alternatively, you can invest in some screen capture software, and there when you capture the web page, it won't necessarily capture the entire screen of the computer with including the URL and the access date as we saw on the previous slide, but it will print that information at the top of the specimen or somewhere around where the specimen is being submitted. And here you can see the access date and URL are provided by the screen capture software. Next slide, please. So here's a look at the form. This is an application form. You can see that the arrows are pointing to web page specimen fields that include space for the URL and the access date. There's a button if you need to provide more. Just click the add additional URL and dates, and you can add additional URLs and dates. Next slide, please. And similarly, in the response form, there's space dedicated to providing this information to us. We're trying to make it as easy as possible for you all to get that information to us. Now let's talk about, next slide, an exception. So if the web page contains a good picture of the mark of the goods bearing the mark, the URL and access date are not necessary. The key here is that the picture itself has to be a good picture. It can't be a computer-generated picture, can't be a digitally altered picture or any other kind of messed with picture. It has to be an actual good picture of the goods. And if that's the case, we don't need to rely on the web page itself. We're relying on the picture. Next slide, please. And here's an example of that. GNC for vitamins. There's a good picture of the packaging here bearing the mark. Although it's a web page type specimen, we don't need the URL and access date to accept the specimen. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Renee to talk about some things to avoid when submitting specimens.
Thank you, Mark. Now, when you're trying to decide whether or not to submit a specimen to us from your client, there are a few things you're going to want to do as your due diligence. First thing is it's always helpful for an examining attorney if we have questions and we need to call and contact you if we're confused about, just what are we looking at. Sometimes if you are knowledgeable about that specimen. So be sure and discuss with your clients about the specimens that are going to be submitted. Make sure that the quality is good quality. It's difficult when the specimens are of marginal quality, blurry, difficult to read. We typically won't refuse a specimen if we can figure out, we can see enough of it to make out the mark and make sure that it complies with the requirements of a specimen, even if it's not in the greatest quality. But it's always helpful if you give us something that's nice and clear. Next slide, please. If you're going to give us a display, make sure that you give us the entire display so that we see as much of it as possible. We sometimes get closely cropped displays where maybe there's only one good showing on a table, and it's difficult to determine whether that's an actual display or if it's just a picture of the mark and the mark's not actually on the product. And then it's always helpful for us if you highlight or put arrows at places where you feel the mark is showing proper use. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to say this a third time about brochures for goods specimens. Generally, they are not going to be acceptable. So avoid giving us brochures as specimens for goods. If you do give us brochures, though, you definitely need to also give us an explanation as to how those brochures are used at the point of sale. Now, you should also consider giving us a couple of good specimens. Now, let me be very careful about what I mean by this. I am not suggesting that you just throw everything you have at us and hope something fits. No. What I'm saying is if you have a couple of really good specimens, give us those couple of good specimens so that on the off chance there's something wrong with the one that you were going to submit alone, if there is one that is acceptable, we'd be able to go ahead and accept that specimen and not have to send you an office action. I want to be very clear that what we do not want to see are any specimens that would be digitally altered, digitally created, or mock-ups as multiples of the specimen. Those are not acceptable, and you should not allow your client to put those into your application. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, we've come to the end, and again, we want to thank you for coming. Here are some resources and some areas where you can learn more about specimens and specimen issues. I'm going to turn it back over to Tasha, and she's going to open the floor for questions. Okay, Tasha, we can't hear you. And let's go to the next slide too, so that if anybody needs to submit a question, what we're going to do is ask you to send them to the email that you see on the slide here. All right, here we go. So the first question is, will you please discuss book specimens? For instance, if it's a series name, but it's on 1, the spine, 2, the back of the book cover, or 3, on the inside title page, do those qualify? So for book specimens, you certainly do, of course, have to show a series, so as you avoid that title of a single work refusal. We look for those uses to be in the traditional places that one would find the producer of the book. So if it's a series, yes, we look to see if it's on the spine. We can certainly see it on the back book cover. Possibly it could be on the inside title page. So there's no one answer to book specimens, but what I would say is that it needs to be distinguishable from the title of the book. All right, I'm going to turn it to Mark. Mark, there's a question directed to you.
Sure. The question is there a rule regarding how old a website screenshot specimen should be in order to be accepted by the Trademark Office for statements of use, maintenance filings, etc.? For example, a website screenshot may be submitted with a registration that isn't dated within a certain time period of filing. And there's a two-part answer to that question. The first part is for purposes of application or filing an SOU or an AAU, there's no hard and fast rule for how contemporaneous that specimen has to be. But a good practice is to make it as contemporaneous as possible so that it represents use at the time you're filing. It's a little bit different post-registration. For post-registration filings, of course, we're asking that you show current use of the mark. So in other words, use of the mark in the statutory period for filing your Section 8 or 71. In that case, if the web page specimen is dated outside that statutory period when you're filing, it will not be accepted because it doesn't show current use of the mark in commerce.
Okay. So we have a question. When filing an SOU, would you accept specimens that show the registration symbol adjacent to the mark? The answer to that is it depends. You all know the rule that you should not be displaying the registration symbol unless you have a registered mark. And there is the distinction right there. If you have a prior registration for that mark, you may have a standard character version, or you may have a stylized version that's different from the instant application. There's no problem with having the registration symbol on your specimen. If, on the other hand, you have not registered a trademark with the USPTO, you really should not be displaying that symbol on your specimen until you actually have a registration.
Okay, we have another question. The question is, if a specimen is unacceptable and you change the website to more adequately reflect, acceptability, could the substitute specimen cure the problem, or must the specimen have existed by a particular point in time? And the answer to that question is that you have to show use, and you're swearing to use as of the filing date or the filing date of the statement use or AAU. So if it's not reflecting use as of that date, it probably isn't acceptable and shouldn't be submitted. If you go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Did you finish that question?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. All right. So here's another question. Please address means of ordering in a catalog. Is a phone number to call in an order sufficient? What about the websites for goods that are industrial or highly specialized or expensive products, and therefore there is no buy now option, but a request for quote button? And what about when there's no buy now option and there's a request for quote button instead? Okay, there's a lot to unpack in that question. All right, so what I'm going to say about the means of ordering in a catalog is we follow the case law. The case law requires things like an order page. We also, want to be able to see that there's some kind of an order form, not just a phone number and a web page. That's generally not going to meet the requirements for a catalog. Now, as far as industrial or highly specialized or expensive goods where one would not actually order them online, that gets into a situation where we have to consider what are the customs in that particular industry, and that's where you can be helpful when you give us the specimen. You can give some of that background information. That said, if you give us a specimen that is a website, it needs to be it has to be distinguishable from something that would just advertise that the goods are available. It's got to cross over into the land of we're now offering you a means for purchasing the goods. So requesting a demo is probably in the same category as the demo button that we talked about with regard to software. It doesn't necessarily offer it's not an offer of sale so much as it is an offer to try and inspect the goods. And in that case, it's not going to be able to show an online electronic point of sale display. So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay, we have another question. This one's pretty simple. Are labels okay even if they're purely digital? And the short answer to that question is probably not, no, because the specimen has to show mark as actually used in commerce. So a digital label is something that wouldn't be placed on the goods and put into the stream of commerce. So it wouldn't be acceptable as a specimen.
Okay. All right, so here we have another question. If the download button is behind a paywall, that is, only members can download, but the public can view and use but not download, would that specimen that shows an image from behind the paywall be refused because only the members can download? I apologize, I'm trying to edit this as I'm reading it. That is, if the trademark examiner went to the site, they would not see the download option. Okay, so I think what you're asking is if it's not obvious that you could download the software on the specimen, would we refuse it? I apologize if that's not what you're asking. And the answer to that is yes, we would have to refuse that because downloadable software is a good. And if what we're looking at is simply giving us information about the software, it then falls into the category of being merely advertising. Now, probably, the best way is if there is a way for folks to actually download the goods, and it really doesn't matter that only members can see it. If the customers are members, then by all means, give us the specimen showing that the members can actually download the software. Your specimen has to show all of the required criteria. The examining attorney cannot add evidence to the file, so even if they were to go on a website and be able to verify that it actually is downloadable. If on the face of that specimen, it's not clear that the software is downloadable, they would have to do a refusal in that situation.
Okay, another question we have. Please address guidelines on the acceptability of the following advertising materials for services. So again, we're in the world of services, and advertising is acceptable type of specimen for services. And specifically, they're looking at press releases, invoices, and contracts. I'll start with the easiest first. Invoices are acceptable. Specimens for services, assuming it displays the mark, it associates the mark with the services, and invoice can be acceptable. Press releases are a little bit, it depends. If they're publicly available on the applicant's website, they can be acceptable. Again, they have to display the mark and associate the mark with the services. Contracts, I'm not sure. I think, and I'll give you a TMEP site in a second. Contracts probably would be okay. Again, if it displays the mark, references the services, and makes an association between the two. There's a TMEP section that kind of goes into this a little bit. It's 130104A. So take a look at that and see if that elucidates things a little bit further.
Okay, so what about when a seller is selling a service through a third-party site like Etsy? Not quite sure what you mean by selling a service. I think maybe you meant to say selling a product. These sites don't always allow the seller to put their mark in large print or to change the font. Can a specimen of the third party's website be a proper specimen? If not, how can the mark owner provide a good specimen? So let's deal with the first question there. Yes, you certainly can provide us a point of sale display using a third party website. Websites like Amazon, Etsy, there's Shopify, all of those, as long as you are using the mark in a trademark manner, as long as it is functioning as a source identifying mark, then yes, you certainly can. The mere fact that it's on a third-party website does not discount it from being an online display, electronic display. Now, if on the other hand, you're using it in a manner, and this happens sometimes where the mark is used in a way where it doesn't really stand out very much, it's not perceived by a mark, there's a possibility you might get a failure to function refusal. But again, it doesn't take much. It really doesn't. So you don't have to, we don't require that there be a particular type of font or particular size of font. We're really more concerned with how would this mark be perceived by a typical consumer for this particular product.
Okay, we have a couple more questions, a two-parter. The first one is, how can one successfully submit this is from a gamer. How can one successfully submit specimens for an in-app purchase of virtual goods in a downloadable game or virtual world? I'm not a big gamer, so I'm not sure how it works, but again, I would go back to the general rules on electronic displays. If I'm sure what the difficulty here is going to be is showing the means to purchase. There has to be some click or action the player has to take to purchase the goods. As long as that's clear from the specimen, it could be an acceptable specimen. Then the second part of the question is, do the requirements for software specimens apply to apps? And the answer to that question is absolutely yes. Apps are just a type of software, and they're also software is a good, generally speaking. In other words, there's something you download to your phone or iPad.
Okay. All right, here we have another question. Are slide decks or pitch decks acceptable specimens? Does it matter if it is a PDF or a screenshot of the PowerPoint? What if it is used to gain investors? Okay, so there's three questions there. The first thing is that pitch decks, it depends on what the mark is showing. If it is for goods, it's probably not going to work because a pitch deck sort of in essence is promotional material. And as you know, promotional material is not acceptable for goods. If you're talking about services, it depends again on the nature of the services. There are certainly times when a slide deck can be shown to be promoting the services to consumers. That's a situation where you definitely would want to explain how that pitch deck is used in commerce. If it is only used to gain investors, that is a situation where unless the services have something to do with gaining investors for third parties, probably that's not going to be seen as use in commerce. If a company is using a pitch deck to get funding for itself, that in and of itself is not a service for the benefit of others. So I would be careful with those types of specimens. As far as PDFs or a screenshot of the PowerPoint, I'm going to have to tell you that I deal with this side of the business, so I'm not 100% sure if we accept PDFs at this point. I think we do, but I know we take JPEGs, and so if you want to be for sure safe that your specimen is going to be viewable, it's probably a good idea to send it in JPEG form. I would suggest following up on that question with a technical question to the technical folks. I believe it is help@uspto.gov, but I'm not 100% sure. Look on our website and find out where to get technical assistance, and they can certainly give you some guidance as to the format of your slide deck. Okay.
Okay, this is kind of a long question, but it's basically about the curb karma example, and there was some confusion as to when an app is doing the work versus and providing a service versus when it's not. The way I think about this is if the app is performing a service activity, if the service activity is taking place in the app or by the app, then it's providing a service. It doesn't mean necessarily that you don't also have a good specimen for a downloadable app. You might have that as well. But you might also have a service being provided through that app if the activities are taking place in the software, rather than the user or consumer having to do things to perform the activity that's listed as the service. That's kind of the distinction there. I'm sure there's gray areas in between where it's harder to distinguish between the two, but that's the distinction we generally make between when it's software versus services provided via software.
All right. Now that there are specific fields on the form webpage for the webpage URL and access date, do we still have to also put that information on the screen capture? The answer to that is no. As long as that information is somewhere in the application, we will have what we need. So there are, as Mark sort of explained earlier, there are numerous ways of giving that information to us in your application.
Okay, how about specimens that are already of record? Can they be submitted for your maintenance filings? For example, can a specimen downloaded from TSDR be used to show use in commerce? Again, we're showing current use in commerce. If that represents current use in commerce, that may be acceptable, but it's a better practice to show the specimen that's contemporaneous with the filing of the maintenance filing.
Okay. Is there a standing prohibition on photos with solid white or black backgrounds as specimens of goods? Many e-commerce sites use a solid background, and applicants may have high quality photos with such backgrounds, yet I have never had an examiner accept one with the white background. Okay, so I need to think about this question a little bit because I'm not quite sure the fact scenario. So, first of all, there's no standing prohibition regarding backgrounds. What may be happening is that there is an issue where maybe there's some kind of matching issue going on with the mark and the specimen, or perhaps what's being submitted looks like it is a digitally created specimen. If you've got high quality photos, if you're having trouble with a black or white background, it may be a situation where you might want to crop out all the extra material and just submit the part that constitutes the photo of the, I'm assuming of the goods themselves, but it would also work for services. But that's the best I can do with that question right now. I'm not 100% sure of the fact scenario that you're referencing.
Can I jump in here? They might be talking about these retouched images that we get sometimes as specimens, and they're taken from a website or something, so they've been, not doctored, but they've been processed to look very good. And that there's no prohibition against that, but if you're worried about drawing a refusal in those situations, rather than just providing the photograph or the retouched image or the image on the white background, why not provide the whole point of sale display? That way, the examining attorney is more likely to see that as an acceptable specimen. Another question. I have a follow-up question. The post-registration website specimen question. Are you saying that we have to wait until the statutory period opens to obtain a specimen from our client? We can't use a specimen created a week or two or a month before the statutory period opens. If it's representing what is going on during the statutory period, it could be acceptable. But I mean, it's always better to not raise the question in the examiner's mind as to whether that is showing current use or not.
Okay. All right, so we've got a really good question here. An applicant was unable to use a mark for advertising services during trade shows in 2020 because of COVID. However, the applicant was able to use the trademark in the context of virtual trade shows with potential clients via Zoom, Teams, or other means. Is the use of the trademark in the PowerPoint presentations or videos used during the virtual trade shows acceptable? I would say most likely yes, they are. But again, if you simply give a PowerPoint presentation with no additional explanation as to how that PowerPoint was used, the examining attorney isn't going to have that background to make a good decision there. But give us that background information so that we can make a proper determination in that situation. All right, and here's another one. If you have a good specimen for goods, but the image is small, can you submit an additional close-up that uses a magnification tool? Sure you can, absolutely. We understand that there are limits to how much you can improve the quality of an image and a specimen. And so if you give us the specimen, you can certainly give us a second page that enlarges the image. But again, give us an explanation as to what that second page is so that the examining attorney will be able to properly analyze what that particular specimen is and won't think of it, well, those are just two bad specimens.
Okay, I got kind of the same question again, so I must not have answered it very well. Can specimens that are already in the record be submitted for maintenance filings? For example, can a specimen downloaded from TSDR be used to show use in commerce? I would say you shouldn't do that. I mean, does that show current use? Again, this is what we're looking for. Current use, meaning use in the statutory period. It's likely not representative of that use and wouldn't be acceptable.
Okay, so If you file a specimen and it is rejected, is there any way to change your application to an ITU after the specimen rejection? Or is the only thing to do is file a new application, ITU? Okay, so I'm going to answer that question by saying it depends on where you are at the point of that refusal. So let's assume that you are prior to the mark being published and you filed 1A. If you do that, then you can always, prior to publication, amend the filing basis to 1B and then give us a specimen after the mark is actually in use. If, on the other hand, the issue comes up after an SOU, the answer there is it depends. If your SOU is in the first 6 months of the filing period and you have filed what we call an insurance extension, you would be able to move forward. You would not be able to change it to 1B, but you'd be able to move forward your use dates. At the same time, if it's at the SOU period and you haven't filed your SOU yet, you get your notice of allowance, you can simply file an extension of time if you're not sure. It's always better to file either an extension or an insurance extension with your filing of your SOU, just in case you run into problems with your specimen like this. Because on the back end, once it's been published, there is no going back to ITU. But on the front end, if it's prior to publication, yes, you can amend to 1B. Hopefully that answers your question.
Got a question about apparel and footwear. Is it necessary for ticketing to be attached to the product? Without visiting a retail store, this can be difficult to produce. In the past, photographs of ticketing itself have been accepted, but it's my understanding they aren't accepted anymore. I think by ticketing, we're talking about tags and things like that. And like Renee was explaining during her presentation, if it's attached to the goods, that's great. But if it's unattached, we can accept it if there's that information indicating that it's an actual tag used in commerce. So information about the goods, pricing, UPC codes, size. Thank you, Renee. Things like that.
Weight.
Yeah. So if that kind of information is on the tag, we can accept it apart from from being affixed to the goods.
All right, so Mark, you're up again. They're asking about the statutory period.
Does the statutory period for use include use during the grace period? Yes. So you can file during the grace period and show use during the grace period, yes.
It's always good when there's a yes or no answer. Okay, do we have any more questions? You all asked very, very good questions. I think this is a very experienced group of practitioners.
Tough questions.
Right. No questions. No more questions. All right.
Go
ahead.
Looks like something might be coming in.
Oh yeah. We're about to get you out of here. We'll give you back a half an hour, but it looks like we've got maybe a few questions coming in.
Okay. One last one for me. Can you please touch briefly on the requirements relating to specimen audits, please? So there's a lot in there, but specimens for audits are going to be generally the same as regular specimens, except they're going to have to show use with the specific good or service audited. So there has to be, if it's not affixed to the particular good or service and it's not clear that it's socks, for example, the tag or whatever should be labeled as socks. So we know exactly that this specimen is associated with socks and not some other article of clothing. And that's kind of the difference between specimen. We need to know that exact relationship between that exact good or service and that proof of use specimen.
Okay. Well, it looks like if we don't have any more questions, looks like we've come to the end of our discussion today. We certainly hope that you got something out of today and will be able to use some of the information in your practice. Mark, did you want to add anything at anything as closing?
No, I'm very happy with the turnout, and I'm glad everybody was able to attend. I hope, like Renee said, that I know there's probably things in here that people already knew, but hopefully there was something in here that, turned on a light bulb or enabled you to learn something new today. So thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn you over to Tasha now.
Thank you, Mark and Renee, and thank you all for attending our presentation today. Although we didn't get to all of the questions that we had, we will certainly use the questions and the feedback received from today to determine how we can update or expand our resources on and information on specimens. In a few minutes, you will receive an email with a survey. We hope that you will complete the survey to let us know how we did today and provide suggestions for future webinar topics. For those viewing the recorded version of this webinar, please feel free to email your feedback and suggestions to tm_webinar@uspto.gov. We are also continuing to collect feedback on implementation of the Trademark Modernization Act. If you are familiar with the Trademark Modernization Act, or if you would like to know more, there's a page on our website with more information. If you have comments, please send your written comments to tmfeedback@uspto.gov. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.